Sunday, 21st of May, 1995. A young 19-year-old man, sadly, takes his last breaths on this earth. His last months of life were pure torture, writhing and twitching in agony, unable to communicate. Only the previous year, he was seemingly fit and healthy. His life had been tragically cut short by a terrifying new disease that could strike out of nowhere and kill in a mere 13 months. He became patient zero of this new, shocking discovery. Today, Descent into Darkness examines the horrifying family of diseases that culminated in an epidemic that affected animal and human alike. Prion diseases. Background. Firstly, we must of course answer the obvious question, what is a prion? To put it very simply, a prion is a misformed protein that is found in the brain and spinal column, a deformation that can occur both randomly and via contact with another such protein, which the unfortunate victim has consumed. This error in the genetic coding for the protein causes them to misfold in the wrong direction, or in such a way as to not be compatible with those around it, accumulating first within the lymph nodes before spreading. But this is not the worst part. That comes when this single misfolded protein comes into contact with other normal proteins. It can cause them to also misfold, and then, in turn, cause others to do so as well. This creates a sadly unstoppable chain reaction that will eventually overtake the entirety of the brain and the spinal cord tissues, most notably destroying synapses within the cerebrum and cerebellum. When a sample of infected tissue is placed under a microscope, it presents as a series of holes in the brain tissue that leave it looking like a sponge. This gives rise to the name spongiform encephalopathy, which all prion diseases fall under. Essentially, this is the classical pathology of how a prion disease works. For an extra kick in the proverbials, due to them being proteins, they cannot be killed off by antibiotics, or even by cooking, as they are not alive to begin with. Once you've got it, and they've taken hold, it's going to kill you. Human prion diseases, which we will discuss later, have a prognosis of a maximum of 13 months between the onset of symptoms and death. There is no cure. Prion diseases are a family of maladies that all exhibit essentially the same symptoms and outcomes, but are distinctly different from each other by how they are transmitted. To get a proper idea about the history of these diseases, we shall look at the most prominent examples, both animal and human. Ovine spongiform encephalopathy, or OSE, also known as Scrapy. Scrapy was first identified all the way back in 1732 in the UK, when it was noticed that several sheep and goats had suddenly begun exhibiting a series of highly out-of-character behaviours. The disease got its name from the main characteristic symptom of the animals relentlessly scraping their back and sides against fences, walls, and large stones, even to the point that their coats and skin were completely flayed off and nothing but bare muscle and bone remaining on the spot. The other classic symptom of Scrapy includes a haunched stance, repetitive lip smacking and chewing motions, even when not actively eating, and also ataxia, which is a loss of muscle control, leading to the animal's inability to keep up with the rest of the flock, leaving them isolated. Once the nerve damage has become too advanced, the poor animal is left unable to stand or walk properly, and random spasmodic twitching is all that they can muster. The disease is known to spread from infected ewe to lamb via their milk. The incubation period between infection and onset of symptoms is thought to be around 2 to 5 years, with the average prognosis of an infected animal being 1 to 6 months once the disease has taken hold. Thankfully, there has never been a recorded instance of Scrapy crossing the species barrier into humans, so whilst eating contaminated lamb or mutton from these animals is a risk, it does not mean that a human will necessarily contract the disease. Farmers are still required to be on the lookout for signs of Scrapy and immediately report any suspicions to their country's farming authority, in the UK's case, DEFRA, who will then quickly isolate all suspected infected beasts from the group and cull them to stop the spread. Kuru. Kuru is a human form of transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, or TSE, that was first shown amongst the cannibalistic tribes of Papua New Guinea, who, as part of their rituals, would intentionally consume the bodies of their deceased relatives, including the brain. This ritual was seen as a way of returning their life force or spirit to the community. As you can imagine, this opens up the figurative door for prions to enter the systems of healthy individuals. Kuru derives its name from the Foray people's word meaning to shake, due to the propensity of victims to exhibit severe uncontrollable muscular tremors. Kuru manifests in 3 distinct stages: ambulant, sedentary, and terminal. The primary ambulant phase of the disease will see the sufferer begin to have difficulty pronouncing words, unsteadiness on their feet, and the classical tremors. The sedentary stage sees the tremors become much more severe, and it is now impossible for them to walk unaided. Dramatic mood swings will occur, with severe depression all the way to spontaneous outbreaks of uncontrollable laughter. Muscular control is severely decreased by this point too. Finally, the terminal stage will leave the victim with far advanced symptoms as previously described, along with difficulty swallowing, incontinence, and next to zero communication skills, and progressive loss of vision. And toward the very end of life, most likely due to the inability to move, will develop open sores. Of course, then, as the name of the stage implies, death will follow shortly after. But now, we shall examine 3 more diseases that brings the story more up to date, and caused one of the worst scandals in British food safety that still has long-reaching consequences to the present. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. CJD is a randomly occurring prion disease that does not appear to be linked to consumption of infected meat. The disease got its name from its discoverer, Walter Spielmeyer, who named it in homage to 2 other German neurologists, Hans-Gerhard Creutzfeldt and Alfons Maria Jakob. Worryingly, 70% of the poor sufferers will not last more than 4 to 6 months after diagnosis. The other 30% will not last much more than that, and there is no cure. All that can be done is to dose the patient up with opioids in the hope of relieving some of the pain. By the time death comes, the victim is reduced to little more than a twitching, incontinent wreck of the person they once were. It is identified through a very rapid onset dementia with loss of memory, personality changes, hallucinations, and uncontrollable muscular spasms. Much like Kuru, the disease will also lead to ataxia, changes in gait, and a much stiffened posture. A lot of victims will succumb to respiratory illnesses such as pneumonia, as the coughing reflex is severely impaired, leading to choking and the inability to shift the fluid in the lungs, effectively drowning them. Sometimes the disease can be passed through genetics by a defect on the PRP gene that tells the proteins how to fold. If this signal becomes distorted, the proteins will misfold, leading to the inevitable self-sustaining feedback loop as described previously. CJD can be detected through tests of the cerebral spinal fluid, or via an electroencephalogram, or a magnetic resonance imaging, which can show degeneration of brain tissue. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, also known as mad cow disease. BSE was first observed in 1986 when several cattle began showing the exact same signs as Scrapy. This highly alarming discovery was the direct consequence of perhaps the single most stupid, reckless, and morally questionable decision in British agricultural history. A few years earlier, some bright spark had hit upon the idea of bulking out the expensive cow feed by also including ground-up bone and waste meat products from cows. Now, setting aside the fact that this is morally reprehensible, at the time, this was considered a huge boon for cattle farmers as it greatly reduced the price of feed per ton and provided a good protein boost for the cows themselves. More protein, meaning more muscle, or in this case, meat. On paper, this was very much a winner-winner ground-up cow dinner. The price of beef fell and the savings were passed directly on to the farmer and then the consumer. When small numbers of cattle began to show the same symptoms of Scrapy in the December of 1984, severe concerns began to be raised in the agricultural community and the Public Health Ministry. These were further confirmed by more suspicious cases the following year, the final confirmation coming through in June of 1987. Autopsies and experiments showed that BSE could be readily transferred into sheep, proving that the diseases were related. But this set in motion a ticking time bomb that would cause widespread panic throughout the UK and in the wider world. Variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, VCJD. The disease that would finally light the touch paper on a world scandal would be the discovery of VCJD, the crossover of BSE into humans via the consumption of infected beef. It is likely that VCJD could well have crossed the species barrier at some point before, but considering the consumption of cow brains and spinal cord is highly rare, certainly in the Western world, would have let the occurrence fly very much below the radar. Nevertheless, the formerly agricultural problem had now very much become a human one. The unfortunate lad who I alluded to in the introduction that would become patient zero of this new and scary disease was named Stephen Churchill. He had begun exhibiting the classical signs of CJD at a much earlier stage in life than is normal. His condition would very quickly degenerate before the disease finally took him. Stephen's sad passing would mark the beginning of a massive public health scare that would have a huge global impact and go on to claim another 177 lives. VCJD has a longer prognosis than classical CJD, but that only extends the median length of illness from 5 months to around 12 or 13 months, so hardly a great improvement for the poor victims. In the modern day, there are certain drugs such as pentasan polysulfate which can slow the progression of the disease, but sadly, the result is always the same. Jonathan Quick of Harvard Medical School's Global Health and Social Medicine Department described VCJD as a Frankenstein disease, as it was directly created by the human decision to feed primarily herbivorous animals with meat and bone meal, and was the direct link to this previously purely zoological problem to enter the human food chain and wreak utter devastation on those unlucky enough to have contracted it. Impact and damage control. The huge shock that came along with the discovery of VCJD was the drastically different age group of the sufferers compared to classical CJD. The normal strain of sporadic or familial CJD has a median age of its victims of around 68, whereas VCJD took the median age all the way down to 28, a huge drop that affected the lower end of the age range. This is what led to the huge panic that surrounded the disease when it became widely known. Suddenly, it wasn't just a rare malady of the aged, it could seemingly affect anyone, at any point. Of course, there was a need for the government to limit the potential damage to the economy and agriculture by launching a large campaign to reassure the public that British beef was safe. Many immediately ceased buying beef, causing the market to drop like a stone. The pushback from the government did little to restore faith as the numbers of those contracting VCJD slowly grew. The very idea that you could be fine 1 minute only to be reduced to a gibbering wreck and at death's door within a comparatively short space of time was a massive blow. But, of course, in classic British governmental style, they completely cocked it up. The most infamous moment of the scandal came when the then Health Minister, John Gummer, was filmed trying to reassure the public of the overall safety of British beef in the May of 1990. The problem came when he was filmed trying to feed his own 4-year-old daughter, Cordelia, a burger, which she rejected, quite possibly because she was intimidated by all the people crowding round and the cameras shoved near her face. Gummer quickly took a bite of the burger himself to try and gloss over Cordelia's negative reaction, and over-exaggerating how tasty it was, but the damage was already done. The junket was a total disaster for Gummer and the Health Ministry. The press and the public absolutely lambasted him for the perception that he was almost forcing his own daughter to eat the beef just for a cheap photo opportunity, which, given her tender age and the huge panic around the outbreak, was yet another screw-up. Politicians really are the most morally bankrupt individuals. Of course, one could argue that it was important for the government to try and reassure the public to avoid the total collapse of the British farming industry, which would have been an economic suicide. In a note of highly unfortunate tragic coincidence, an article published by The Guardian on the 12th of October 2007 reported that a 23-year-old Elizabeth Smith, the daughter of one of Mr. Gummer's family friends, had succumbed to VCJD. Elizabeth's father, Roger, a retired vicar, stated, "If you live in the depths of the countryside, like Elizabeth did, there aren't burger bars everywhere, so she hardly ate any. Sometimes she would have meat with a meal, sometimes she wouldn't. It wasn't one particular kind of meat either." In 2004, studies showed that VCJD was also transmissible via blood transfusions, which rightly panicked the UK government, who swiftly introduced a ban on those who had received a transfusion after 1980 from donating blood. And since 1999, it has banned UK-donated blood from being used to derive blood products such as albumin, a family of globular proteins found in plasma. Germany and France also introduced a permanent ban on any one of its citizens donating blood if they had lived in the UK between 1980 and 1996 for 6 months or a year respectively. In another tragedy, one person has also been known to have contracted and died from VCJD from eating the brain of a squirrel too. Legacy. Whilst the information in this film is highly sobering and troubling, I would be highly remiss if I were to not reassure you by telling you that all prion diseases are exceedingly rare. Even VCJD would only go on to claim, at the time of writing, 178 cases, the last one being in 2016. And whilst this does not diminish the awful fact that those people had suffered an horrific fate, it should at least give some hope for those who suddenly become terrified of eating beef. I should also point out that for many years now, cattle are no longer fed cattle byproducts, and greater awareness of BSE makes farmers far more diligent in the management and health of their herd. The new guidelines around the disease are very strict, and suspected cases are jumped on instantly, with the animal being isolated straight away and then culled, with its carcass not entering the food chain, usually being taken away and incinerated. But thankfully, as far as I can tell, there has not been a reported case of BSE in Britain since 2006, which should at least give us all hope that a line can be drawn under this scary affliction. But of course, there is still an outside chance of the disease recurring somewhere down the line, given the disease can lay dormant for a time. But let's keep our collective fingers crossed that it never happens. Many countries still have an active ban on the import of British beef, including the USA, whilst Japan, China, South Korea, Canada and Mexico introduced their own bans on US imported beef in 2003 when cases of BSE began to show there, although, from what I can gather, only the first 3 of those countries still have their bans in place. But thankfully for us Brits, VCJD from infected beef is almost non-existent now due to the swift changes in the rules, but as is so often the case, the government took a long time to react to the discovery, and it could be argued that whilst they were trying to reassure everyone, or outright denying or downplaying the original risk, more people most likely fell ill and died. Let us hope that we have seen the last of this awful and terrifying disease. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please consider leaving it a like and share with a like-minded friend. Better yet, consider subscribing to DID and turn on notifications for when I put out new content. Check out my back catalogue to find even more great videos just like this one on all aspects of dark history. What do you think of today's topic? Would you like me to cover more deadly diseases? Let me know in the comments. I do like to try and diversify my content to keep things fresh and interesting, but by all means let me know if you're not into this new direction. Obviously, I will still be doing my usual bread and butter topics, so you will not be deprived, I promise. If you wish to do so, you can support the idea on Patreon or become a channel member, or if you prefer to give a one-off donation, you can do so via the Super Thanks button. And don't forget the DID merch store on Teespring, linked below, to grab yourself some branded swag. And if you simply cannot get enough of my dark, chocolatey voice, I have an alternate channel called DID Reads, where I post other narration content such as poetry, short stories, and famous speeches, etc. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.